Hello, and welcome to our online lecture for Psych 1101 and Psych 1010 at Lanier Technical College. My name is Michael Holman. I am a psychology instructor here at Lanier Tech, and I will be your narrator. Please note that these lectures are intended to assist you in better understanding the material and should not be considered a substitute for attending lecture, reading the text, or completing your assignments. With that said, let's get started talking about thinking, language, and intelligence. So, this time around we're going to define thinking and the various concepts involved in thinking. We're going to describe how language develops. We will identify the concepts of intelligence and the techniques used to measure intelligence. And we'll also describe the controversy surrounding intelligence testing. So, true or false? Only humans can use insight to solve problems. That is false. Crying is an early form of language. That is true. Young children say things like "Daddy goed away" and "Mommy sitted down" because they do understand rules of grammar. That is also true. Street smarts are a sign of intelligence. That is also true. Creative people are highly intelligent. That is false. Creative people are not necessarily highly intelligent. Highly intelligent people are creative. That is also false. Just because you're intelligent does not mean that you are creative. Two children can answer exactly the same items on an intelligence test correctly, yet one child can be above average in IQ and the other can be below average. That is true. Intelligence tests measure many things other than intelligence. That is also true. So, this chapter is for thinking, language, and intelligence, so let's start at the beginning with thinking. What is it? Well, thinking means to attend to information, to represent it mentally, to reason about it, to make judgments and decisions about it. When we think, we usually organize our stuff as concepts. These are mental categories used to group objects, relations, events, abstractions, or qualities that have common properties. They also are organized into hierarchies. Concepts typically follow prototypes. Good examples of a category of a concept is a prototype, with an exemplar being a specific example. These prototypes often can result in both good and bad instances. In this case, we might get overextension, meaning that someone takes a concept for maybe a type of person and overextends it to mean all people that resemble this person. What are the next two letters in this series? That's O, T, T, F, F, S, S, E. So two more letters. A lot of students might say EO. And I can understand that. You're looking for patterns. But what if I told you that the correct answer was actually N and T? Because this actually is the first letter of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So then it would be 9, 10. And of course you're thinking, well, how the heck was I supposed to know that, right? Well, how do you know that? Well, you know that thanks to reasoning. And reasoning can be one of two things. It can be either deductive reasoning or inductive reasoning. Let's start with inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning starts here at the bottom. It is the observation of individual examples. So you see a bunch of examples all doing the same thing. And you notice that. You notice that there are regularities in these specific examples. And so because you keep seeing it over and over again, you create a general principle. So, for example, if you have friends, and they text you information, and you just don't like the text, so you don't text them back, and then they get frustrated with you. And this happens with all of your friends. You might induce the principle that my friends like it when I text them back. That is inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is now taking that general principle and applying it to a specific example, and then coming to a conclusion based on the application of that principle. And this is what Sherlock Holmes did all the time. Of course, he wasn't actually a real person, but the fictional character was very famous for doing this, right? So he would learn all sorts of general principles and then apply them to his cases so that he could come to a conclusion. That is deductive reasoning. Unfortunately, sometimes when we attempt to make reasoning, we make errors in our logic. We're trying to be logical, but nobody's perfect. And one such error is called affirming the consequent. This is when an error is made in assuming that a specific cause is present because a particular result has occurred. Another one that you might be familiar with is confirmation bias, a bias to seek information that will confirm a rule and not to seek information that would refute that rule. So, if you've ever been in an argument with someone and you had to prove yourself right, so you went online and then you Googled something like thingsthatwillprovemeright.com, right? That's confirmation bias. You just went ahead and assumed that you were correct, and now I'm going to go find evidence to prove that I'm right, rather than, well, maybe they are right. So rather than looking for the truth, you are looking for evidence to support your opinion. That is confirmation bias. Meet Linda. She's a 31-year-old, single, outspoken, very bright woman. She majored in philosophy, and she participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Linda is most likely a bank teller, an insurance salesperson, or a bank teller active in the feminist movement. If you said 3, ask yourself why. It's probably because of something called the Representativeness Heuristic, the strategy in which we assume that the more similar something is to a prototype stored in our memory, the more likely it is to belong to the prototype's category. So if we look back at Linda, well, we said that she was a single, outspoken, very bright woman. She majored in philosophy, participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations, and then we think about what we know of feminists, and we might assume that she is one because she closely resembles an example, an exemplar, that we have in our minds of a feminist. But this, of course, is an error in judgment. For example, which occurs more frequently? English words with the letter K in the first, meaning they start with letter K, or in the third position? It is actually the third position. Which is more common, dying from a car accident or a plane crash? The answer is a car accident. What percentage of the chores do you do versus your roommate or your partner do? What's really funny about this one is that when we ask couples this question, each side of the couple will usually say that they do the most chores. So how's that work, right? So all of this is us making errors on judgments. If you were inclined to say that there were more words that started with the letter K, then you made an error in judgment. If you were more inclined to maybe say that dying in a plane crash was more common, then that was an error in judgment. Or if you said that you did the most chores, then that might have been an error in judgment. So where did this come from? Well, it comes from problem solving. When we try to understand a problem, there are several features that we have to consider. We have to think about how the parts relate to one another in a meaningful way, how the elements of mental representation correspond to the elements of the problem in the real world, and we have to rely on that background knowledge that we may already have. One way that we try to solve problems is by using an algorithm. This is a specific procedure for solving a type of problem. You will get the right answer if the right formula is used. We see this in math all the time, right? So a math teacher will often give you formulas, and you just have to know which formula to use in this situation. Another way that you might have used an algorithm is called a systematic random search, where each possible solution is tested according to a particular set of rules. So have you ever been taking a test, perhaps a psychology exam, and it's multiple choice, and you're not sure what the answer is, but what you know you can do is plug in each one of those multiple choice options and see which one makes the most sense, right? That is systematic random search. You're just plugging and chugging, liking to see which one is actually going to resolve this issue. Which one is going to get me the answer that makes the most sense? That's systematic random search. Don't worry, I do it too. Another way that we might try to problem solve is using a heuristic. These are shortcuts, mental rules of thumb that are used to solve a problem quickly. One heuristic is the means end analysis, where you evaluate and reduce the difference between the current situation and the goal, meaning what is the fastest way to get what I want. Analogies are another heuristic, where you refer to a previous problem to solve a new one. So, for example, if you're typing away on your laptop and all of a sudden your laptop freezes, you might manually restart it, right? You hold down the power button until it turns off, and then you turn it back on again, and oh look, it's better now. But what happens if later you're typing away on your laptop and you get the blue screen of death? So you get that blue screen and there's nothing you can do about it. Well, you might refer to the previous computer problem, right? And hold down the power button again. Hopefully that'll fix it. Because it worked the first time, maybe it'll work again. There are several factors that affect problem solving. The first is expertise. Experts use parallel processing, while novices use serial processing. For example, all of you are not experts in psychology, but I am. So if both of us were given a case study and we had to diagnose this person with a psychological disorder, I would look at it and think, okay, well, these are their symptoms, this is their case history, this is what they're currently reporting, this is what runs in their family. All that would come through my mind all at once. That's happening parallel, just like parallel lines. While you guys might be having to ask yourself, okay, what is a disorder? That's just starting at number 1. So that is serial processing. So experts use parallel processing with multiple things happening at once. Novices start with one thing at a time and then move to the next. They're not comfortable enough to do any more than that. And you know, it's not just psychology, this is anything. If I'm driving along on the side of the road and all of a sudden my car breaks down, I'm going to pull over, I'm going to pop the hood, I'm going to get out, and I'm going to look at that front of the car, and I'm just going to stand there with my hands on my hips for a while, just staring, because I have no idea what to do to fix a car like that. So maybe I get lucky and my friend who's a mechanic drives by and pulls over, and while he's looking at it and he knows exactly what's going on, I'm still trying to figure out where the engine is. That's another example of the difference between an expert and a novice. Another thing that might affect problem solving is your mental set. Your tendency to use an approach that was previously successful with the similar problem. We've seen this with similar heuristics. Insight can also help us. This is the sudden perception permitting the solution. So you just all of a sudden get it. Aha! That light bulb goes off, right? That's insight. Incubation. So you stand back from a problem for a while and the solution comes to you as a flash of insight. So this is when somebody tells you to don't think about it or to go walk it off or to go sleep on it, right? And so you're not thinking about the problem, and then hours later or maybe days later, all of a sudden, you've come to a solution. That is incubation. Functional fixedness is an interesting factor. It actually is a negative way of affecting problem solving, so it can hinder our ability to solve problems. It is the tendency to think of an object in terms of its familiar function. So we think that this can only do what it's supposed to do. A hammer only hammers nails. It doesn't do anything else. For example, Using the materials provided, mount the candle on the wall. How might you do it? Well, if you said anything other than this, then you are the victim of functional fixedness. In most cases, the box didn't even register as an option, right? It was just tax, candle. What else am I supposed to work with? We saw the box as simply a vessel for the tax, when in reality we could have used it to hold up the candle as well. Now, there are some more heuristics that we use when trying to figure out how to make a decision. We've already talked about the representative heuristic, but there's also the availability heuristic. This is when you believe that something is more likely to happen because you have more relevant events as examples in recent memory. So you might think that a plane is more likely to fall out of the sky if there have been more news stories of that happening lately. Another interesting one is the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. You first have your first estimate, and this serves as your anchor. So you think, okay, this is what I believe. But then you get more information, new information. So you'd make a few tweaks to that. You make a few adjustments, but still remaining within your first decision. Another factor is the framing effect, where the context in which information is presented affects decision making. And you know, as a professor, I see this all the time. You know, a student will say, "Oh, please help me. My car broke down, and my dog died, and my parents are out of town, and I've been going through a lot. Please let me turn in this assignment late." Right? We've heard it all. Professors really have heard it all. We see it all the time. Or maybe, just maybe, you might have experienced this where you have two friends that are fighting. And when you ask the two friends what they're fighting about, both of them portray themselves as perfect little angels and the other friend as this evil, irrational person. That's the framing effect. They're trying to convince you to be on their side. But it doesn't always work. Overconfidence is another factor that can affect your decision making. This is when you're unaware of how flimsy your assumptions are, and so you work to bring about the results that fit your own judgment. But you forget information to your judgment, and this leads to self-fulfilling prophecies. Imagine that you're dating a guy, and this guy is constantly saying, "Oh, you're so beautiful. You know, you're just so much better than me. I just know that you're going to leave me. Please don't leave me. Oh, I just know that you're going to leave me. I just know it's going to happen. It's inevitable. You're just so much better than I am. I just know that you're going to leave me. Oh my gosh. Please don't leave me. Please don't ever leave me. I just can't handle it if you leave me, but I know that you're going to. I know it's going to happen eventually." What are you probably going to do with this person? That's right. You're probably going to leave them. Why? Because that's freaking annoying. But it was also a self-fulfilling prophecy. That guy was so confident. He was so sure that you were going to leave him that he made sure that it happened. Okay, so we've talked a lot about thinking. Now let's talk about language. How does language work? Well, we know in studying communication in non-humans that we're not the only ones that can communicate. African gray parrots can talk. Parrots are very famous for talking. Apes are genetically able to show some ability to use language and often can use sign language. Language is communication of information by means of symbols arranged according to rules of grammar. There are several properties of language, like semanticity, meaning the sounds or signs of a language have some kind of meaning. Remember semantics? Same thing. Infinite creativity. You have the capacity to create rather than just imitate sentences. Imagine if you could only make sentences that you've heard before. Nope, you can make up your own sentences whenever you want. New words are made every day in the English language alone. And displacement. The capacity to communicate in another time or place. This is actually pretty amazing because I can send an email out to you at 3 in the morning and you might not read it until 3 in the afternoon 5 days later. That is displacement, and that's amazing. That's the power of language. In a way, that's time travel. So, what makes a language a language? Well, number one, the ability to produce that language must be generative. Language also needs to be understood or comprehended. For example, human beings are amazing. You were able to read that, even though it doesn't make any sense. There are four main aspects of language: phonology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. Phonology is the structure of the sounds of the words in a language. So you've heard of hooked on phonics? Same thing. This is based on phonemes, the sounds that each word is made of. They are the building blocks of speech sounds. Humans produce about 100. But different languages use different phonemes. For example, the French have soft R's that do not exist in English. And the Japanese don't have any soft R's at all. Syntax is the rules for combining different types of words and sentences. This is just your standard English lesson. So if you hopefully remember anything from English, all those rules apply. All of that is known as syntax. Semantics are the meaning of a word, phrase, or sentence. And they are based off of morphemes, which are the smallest units of meaning in a language. So letters, for example. We also need to think about semantics, the meaning, versus syntax, the rules. For example, colorless green ideas sleep furiously is a correct sentence according to syntax. But can you understand it? No, not at all. How can it be colorless and green, right? Fastly dinner eat, ball game soon start. All of those words make sense. The semantics, the meaning makes sense, but they don't follow the rules of grammar. They don't follow the correct syntax for English. Pragmatics is the ways that words and sentences in a language convey meaning indirectly by implying rather than asserting. For example, if I say, "Do you know what time it is?" and you reply with yes, first of all, that's rude. But second of all, you never actually had to say the time, did you? You just said, "Oh yeah, I know what time it is." This is also the basis of metaphors and some humor, especially puns, dad jokes especially. You will see this all the time, right? One of my favorite pun jokes out there, dad jokes you might say, is what do you get when you cross the Atlantic with the Titanic? About halfway. See, it's awful, it's terrible, but they're puns, and puns are some of the best jokes out there. You just have to take it from me. And those work because of pragmatics. You understand what is being implied even though the sentence never actually says it. Bilingualism is when you learn a second language versus learning a first language. This can be tough because now you're having to learn semantics versus phonology. So for example, in Japanese, the word no is usually used as a way to denote that something is of something. So you are saying that this is of something. So you might say that baka no piku, meaning that this person is stupid. That this person comes from being an idiot. But in the English language, no just means no. It means negative. It means no, you will not. So sometimes the sound, the phoneme, will have a different meaning, a different semantic, depending on the language. So this can be a little tricky if you've ever taken a Spanish or a French class and you've experienced this yourself. Now, bilingualism in the brain, we have found that being bilingual is actually really good for your brain. It actually can allow your brain to make more synaptic connections, and in children, they tend to understand material better. Which brings us to a question that relates back to the thinking section of this chapter. What is thinking? Is it words? Is it images? Or concepts? Or is it something else? According to the linguistic relativity hypothesis, our thoughts are shaped by language. The language you speak limits the thoughts that you have. For example, the Inuits have multiple different ways of thinking about snow. They have many, many different words for snow, but they don't really change the way that they think, if that makes sense. So they can actually perceive different versions of snow. So they can see freshly fallen snow, and they can see snow that's been packed in for a while, snow that has ice on top of it, all that sort of stuff. While most Americans just have snow. So that changes the way you think about things. Their language changed what they perceived. Another example is the Dani. They have a particular way of thinking about color. They only have 3 colors. And so while they might see pink or purple or something like that, they're more likely to say that pink is the color red, or their word for the color red. Doesn't mean that they can't recognize those colors, but it does mean that they don't have a word for it, so they just lump it in with another color they do recognize. There is mixed evidence about the linguistic relativity hypothesis, but we do know there is a relationship between language, memory, and perception. Mental contents, like those that arise during perception, but arise from stored information rather than on immediate sensory input, are known as mental images. We've talked about them a little bit in previous chapters for memory. You might have a visual mental image. For example, does the Statue of Liberty hold the torch in their left or right hand? And these mental images will occur with all 5 senses. By the way, it's in her right hand. Visual imagery has a very similar nature to visual perception. There are 3 properties of visual mental imagery: spatial extent, a limited field of view, limited resolution, all sorts of things. Now, when we think about concepts, these aren't images and these aren't words. What are they? A concept is the idea that underlies the meaning of words or images. For example, you might base your concept off of typicality, meaning that you look at these 3 animals and you realize, oh, they're all dogs. They all have similar typical features of a dog. They also might be very similar to a prototype that you had for a dog. But also, we have to think about things at the basic level. For example, one of these is not like the others. That's right, the dog is not like the other 2, because the dog is an animal and the other 2 are plants. Language is not necessary for thinking. Concepts can be understood without knowing the word for that concept. And we see that all the time. We see that in this class, right? Where maybe many times you've been studying the material and then you go, oh, that's what that's called? Oh, I had no idea. I knew what it was, I just didn't know it had a word for it. There you go. So the linguistic relativity hypothesis says that language structures the way we perceive the world. But there is some criticism about this hypothesis. Images and abstract logical propositions may be used as units of thought, but the range of concepts represent priority of the language, not cognitive limitation. So, going back to the Inuits, snow was their priority, but it doesn't mean that they wouldn't be able to figure out what sand is. They just might not have a word for it. So, when we develop language, it starts as pre-linguistic vocalizations. This is as a baby. We're crying, we're cooing, we're babbling, all sorts of things. All children babble usually the same sounds, even deaf kids. By 9 to 10 months, foreign sounds are dropped, and your first word is spoken by about 1 year old. We then can start using holophrases, which are single words that express complex meanings, and then telegraphic speech, which are 2-word sentences that are grammatically correct and have a sequence of emergence of various 2-word sentences. And this is pretty universal across all languages. We also will see overregulation, the application of regular grammatical rules to irregular verbs and nouns. So like he goaded away. And between 7 and 9 years old, children will realize that words can have more than one meaning. Learning theory says that we learn language due to imitating those around us, like our parents, and being reinforced or encouraged thanks to our parents. There's also the social cognitive perspective, which says that our parents serve as models, and because we watch them, we then behave like they do. Another approach is the nativist approach. It says that there are certain innate natural factors that cause children to attend to and perceive language in certain ways. The psycholinguistic theory says that language acquisition involves the interaction of environmental influences and inborn tendencies to acquire languages. So it basically is saying that those previous two theories, they're both right. Language acquisition device is something that represents the inborn tendency. It is a part of our brain. It is a part of our mind. It is something that we just have a natural tendency to do, which is to learn languages. It prepares our nervous system to learn grammar, and there are certain rules of grammar that are universal. Okay, so we've talked about thinking, we've talked about language. Now it's time to talk about intelligence. Intelligence is the underlying ability to understand the world and cope with its challenges. It is tied to achievements such as academic performance and occupational status. Intelligence is made up of a number of mental abilities or factors, according to the factor theory of intelligence. For one, we have Spearman's G factor. G stands for general intelligence. The S factor represents specific intelligence. Thurstone believed that there were 9 specific factors which represented your primary mental abilities. From Thurstone's 9 specific factors, we find Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. So Howard Gardner believed that there were 8, maybe 9 intelligences that everybody could excel at. You could have linguistic intelligence. You're good at language. You're good at words. Spatial intelligence. You can really shape a room. Or someone that could also be really good at parallel parking. Musical intelligence. You are really good at music. Logical, mathematical intelligence. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence. You understand the way your body moves, how your body behaves, and what you can do in order to maybe be the best dancer or the best athlete. Intrapersonal intelligence. This one's interesting. This is intelligence about yourself and about your own emotions. So being very self-aware. Interpersonal intelligence is recognizing other people's emotions and being very aware of how other people are feeling. We call it having empathy. And then there's naturalist intelligence. So being aware of how nature works, how the environment works, the circle of life, all that fun stuff. The last one here is existential intelligence. And this is tentative because, quite honestly, existential intelligence is all about knowledge of what happens after death. And we don't know. We don't know what happens after death, scientifically speaking. But there are many people that think that they do. So you have priests, rabbis, sheiks, all sorts of people, philosophers that have an idea of what happens after you die. What happens in the next world, so to speak. And so while we don't know that any of that actually exists, if they are right, then they would be quite intelligent in that field. One theory of intelligence is known as the Triarchic theory of intelligence. It was developed by Robert Sternberg, and it says that there are 3 types of intelligence out there, so a lot less than Howard Gardner's 8. It says that you either are analytically intelligent, so this means book smart. You are creatively intelligent. You're art smart. Or you are practical. This means you have street smarts. And you can have high intelligence in one and low intelligence in others. So we all probably know someone that is incredibly book smart but doesn't have a lick of common sense, right? So they would be high in analytical, low in practical. Emotional intelligence is a combination of intrapersonal, so your own emotions, and interpersonal skills, so someone else's emotions. Self-insight and self-control is very important here. So someone with high emotional intelligence is able to control themselves and maybe not have a huge blow-up whenever something doesn't go their way. Someone with high emotional intelligence is really well capable of coping with stress, depression, and dealing with their own aggressive behavior and aggressive behavior in others. We also want to address the connection between creativity and intelligence. Creative people do things that are novel or new and useful. They often will take risks, they will defy limits, and they will appreciate art and music. There is a relationship between intelligence test scores and standard measures of creativity, but it is only moderate, meaning that Just because you're creative does not mean that you're necessarily intelligent, and vice versa. So when we measure creative thinking, we call it convergent thinking and divergent thinking. Convergent thinking is thoughts that are limited to your present facts. You think inside the box. This is the one that is best used when thinking about intelligence testing. Divergent thinking is when you freely associate to elements of the problem, and this is best used when measuring creativity. Okay, so now we're going to move from talking about intelligence to talking about intelligence testing. How do we measure intelligence? So let's start with a brief history. Alfred Binet and Theodore Simon were a couple of French guys, and they developed the first intelligence test between 1904 and 1911. It identifies students who need extra help, and tests many normal children at each age, and compares every individual's score to what the normal children made. This helped them to develop something called a mental age, as well as a chronological age. So your mental age and your chronological age, what are they? Well, if you are 14 years old, then that's your chronological age. But if you've ever had someone say, oh, he's 14, but he reads on a 10th grade level, then what they're really saying is that mentally, you are 16 years old. So that would be your mental age. The Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scale was one of the first tests. Binet-Simon first created their own test, and this produced a child's mental age. The SBIS was then adapted to create an intelligence quotient, or an IQ. Yes, this is where the term IQ comes from. Your IQ score reflects the relationship between your mental age and your actual age. So how do we calculate your IQ? Well, William Stern was the first one to really address this, and he had a serious problem, and that's that people don't get more stupid with age. And so to address this, he said that your IQ was equal to your mental age divided by your chronological age times 100. And that was the old way of calculating your IQ. Modern psychologists compare individual scores to a standardized sample. We actually have an enormous book, and it's got random scores from people of all ages and all races and all genders. And we will find out your age, and then we will find your score, and we'll see how it measures up to people in that age. And so it's a massive book, but it is proven very useful when doing intelligence testing. It wasn't until Lewis Terman got a hold of the Binet-Simon test at Stanford University that he developed an American version of the test called the Stanford-Binet test for 2 to adults. Later came David Wexler, and he provides the test that we use most today. The Wexler Adult Intelligence Scale, or the WAIS, and the Wexler Intelligence Scale for Children, or the WISC. Easy way to remember which test is for which. The WAIS is for adults, and it has an A in it. The WISC is for children, and it has a C in it. Both of these tests had performance and verbal subtests. Wexler scales also have separate subscales that measure different verbal and performance tasks, and they came up with a deviation IQ, meaning how much does your IQ deviate or differ from the norm. He also would have group tests to compare you to a group. Here are some examples of the WISC. These are real questions from the WISC exam. For example, here we have matrix reasoning, which measures fluid reasoning. A child is presented with a partially filled grid and asked to select the item that properly completes that matrix. So, which of the 5 options below would you put in the bottom left square? The answer is 4. Spatial reasoning is another famous WISC test that is done. This involves cubes and an image. And so the image will look something like this image here, and the participant, usually a child, is asked to use only the blocks to recreate the image to the best of their ability. Another example is the picture concepts. This measures things like fluid reasoning, perceptual organization, and categorization. From each of the 2 or 3 rows of objects, the child selects objects that go together based on an underlying concept. So, for example, if I said, which of these 2 items go together, the correct answer would be 1 and 3, because they're both animals. Here are some examples of the WAIS. Remember, these are tests for adults, so they're going to be a little bit harder. Which 3 of these pieces go together to make this puzzle? The answer is 1, 2, and 6. If you said 5, remember we asked for 3 pieces to go together in this puzzle, not 2. Which one of these goes here to balance the scale? The answer is 3. And here's another interesting one. When I say go, draw a line through each red square and yellow triangle. So what we'll do here is actually the administrator of the test, the psychologist, will point at this and let them know that's a red square, and point at this and let them know it's a yellow triangle, just to make sure there's no confusion. And then with their own pencil, the psychologist will strike through the red square and strike through the yellow triangle in the example line so that the participant knows exactly what to do. And then once they say go, the participant has to do the same thing. And so we time how long it takes them to search through this, and also taking off time for any errors that they might make along the way. This is the normal curve, famously called the bell curve. So in the middle you have your average scores. So between 85 and 115 is considered within average range on an IQ score. 115 or higher is considered high average to gifted, and anything from 85 or lower is considered borderline to mentally impaired. This is based off of population, which you hopefully remember from our first video lecture. Norming, meaning what is the norm. The mean, if you recall from math class, is the average, so the average is in the middle. And standard deviation. So the standard deviation is how much does your score differ from the average. So if your score was within 2 standard deviations from the mean, then that would mean that you were either over here or you were over here. And that means you are very different from the average score. If it's within 1 standard deviation, then you're pretty normal. Now, a good test must be both valid and reliable. If a test is reliable, it produces consistent results. If a test is valid, it measures what it says it's measuring. The WAIS-IV is highly reliable, but is it a valid measure of intelligence? Well, that's still up for debate. IQ tends to be related to achievement as well. We look at things like your high school and your college grades, your job prestige, your salary, your marital stability. However, IQ accounts for only a small amount of the variation in job success. It doesn't ask about your personality, motivation, education, your culture, all of this stuff, which is just as important in determining how successful you may be. Remember, correlation is not causation. Just because you are incredibly intelligent, it doesn't mean that you necessarily will be successful. Here's just another chart to show the bell-shaped curve and how that looks when it comes to IQ scores. So where do these differences in intellectual functioning come from? Well, first, let's talk about socioeconomic and ethnic differences. If you recall from previous lectures, socioeconomic means financial situation. So how broke are you? We have to consider social class. We know that lower class US children score 10 to 15 IQ points lower than middle and upper class. Is that because they're just not as smart? No, of course not. It's because they don't have as many resources. We also need to consider ethnicity. The average black student, for example, scores about 15 points less than the average white student. Why? because especially when these studies were initially done in the 70s and 80s, most people of color, most African Americans, found themselves in middle to lower class. And so obviously there were going to be more white children in upper class situations, and therefore they would have more resources at their disposal, which would allow for them to perform better on these tests. But we also need to think about culture. For example, Asian Americans are more likely to graduate high school and complete college. Is this because Asian Americans are just naturally more intelligent? No, of course not. What it does mean, though, is that Asian Americans have a culture where success is rewarded and failure is strictly punished. For example, very famous expression is the Asian F. And the Asian F is anything that is not an A. So it is a B, or a B plus even. That is an Asian F, or so the story goes. So there are a lot of expectations from this particular culture to perform better among their kids. And so because they have that pressure, they tend to perform better. But not all of them, of course. Do intelligence tests contain some kind of cultural bias? Well, tests may measure familiarity with the dominant middle-class culture, which in America is white people. So to try and combat that, we have culture-free intelligence tests. We have things like Cattell's culture-fair intelligence test and Good Enough's draw a person test. But even among these tests, European American children outperform African American children on these culture-free tests. So again, they're not as culture-free as we might think. Here's an example of Cattell's culture-free intelligence test. And it seems pretty simple, pretty basic, but this is just one example. There are also gender differences in intelligence tests. Intelligence tests do not show the overall difference in cognitive ability. Girls tend to have superior abilities to boys in verbal skills. Boys excel in visual spatial abilities, and boys tend to score higher on math tests. Group scores, however, represent a greater variation within the group than between groups. So what this means is that if I compare boys and girls in the state of Georgia, then yeah, girls are probably going to have a higher verbal score than boys, and boys are going to have a higher math score than girls. But if I compare boys and girls of Georgia to boys and girls of California, then they seem to be pretty similar. So if I compare a girl from Georgia to a boy from California, their scores tend to be very similar to one another. So the differences are more in the local area than they are in a more nationwide comparison. Okay, so that was the discussion of intelligence. Now let's talk about where this intelligence comes from. Is it nature? Does it come naturally? Or is it nurtured? Is it because of your environment? Well, to study the genetic influences on intelligence, we have done several kinship studies. We have looked at the IQ scores of identical twins and found that they are more alike than for any other pair. There is a moderate correlation between fraternal twins, siblings, and parents and their children, and there are very weak correlations between children and their foster parents or between cousins. When conducting twin studies, the IQ scores of identical twins are higher than fraternal twins. Fraternal twin pairs are very similar as between those of other siblings. IQ scores of identical twins raised together have a higher relationship or correlation than identical twins raised apart. So being raised together is related to IQ similarity. So what this means is that it is more than just genetics. Genetics, because of the identical twin studies, do play a role. We know that. But we're now starting to see that environment also plays a role in how intelligent you may develop. In adoption studies, we have found a stronger relationship between IQ scores of adopted children and their biological parents than between those children and their adoptive parents. So once again, biology does play a very critical factor. Heritability is between 40% and 60%. About half the difference between your IQ score and the IQ scores of other people can be explained by heredity. But environment is also important. Being raised together is related to IQ similarities. When studying the effects of environment on IQ, Stuhlmiller in '99 estimated that the effects of the environment on IQ to be about 57%, or more than half. And he looked at things like your microenvironment and how we select the environment as we age. You know, when we're little kids, our best friends are our neighbors or our classmates, things like that. We don't really have much of a say in who our friends are. We just kind of pick people that are nearby. It's convenient. But as we grow older, we can pick and choose who our friends are. You don't have to be friends with your neighbors. You don't even have to talk to them when you're an adult. But you can choose who your friends are, and you can have friends all over the world. So you choose what kind of environment you're in as you get older. And because you can choose that environment, that in turn can affect your intelligence. Here are findings of studies of the relationship between IQ scores and heredity. And as you can see, cousins had the smallest amount of a relationship, while identical twins that were raised together had the highest connection. Your home environment is an important predictor of IQ scores, especially between the ages of 3 and 8. And also it helps when talking about your education if you have an enriched early environment. If you don't have that, then you don't have as many resources at your disposal to increase your own intelligence. Genetics account for 72% of IQ variation in affluent environments. Affluent means rich. But genetics account for only 15% of IQ variation in impoverished environments, or poor environments. So in rich neighborhoods, 72% of the reason why one kid might have a higher IQ score than the other is because of their genes. But in a poor neighborhood, 15% is the only amount that genetics play in why one kid might have a higher score than the other. The rest is environment. This also comes down to racial differences because for many generations, especially in the United States, many people of color have been in lower income environments, have been in lower scenarios, so they're considered either middle class or lower class. It is only within the last few decades that we've started to see more people of color entering into higher and upper class scenarios. And what do you know? In those situations, when they are in the more affluent environments, their scores go up. We also need to remember that there are certain biases that tests have. For example, there was a test that many students had to take years ago in school. It was called the ITBS test. Maybe you remember it. Maybe you took it. It stands for the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. Now remember, we already said that when developing IQ tests, we have to take a population and then create a norm from it. So that's what the people at the ITBS place did. They took their population, which was the population of Iowa. Guess what kind of race is the majority of people in Iowa? That's right, white people. But this test was then taken and compared to students all over the country. So that means that according to the ITBS, a normal student was a student from Iowa. Can you see how maybe a student from Georgia might be different, and how maybe a black student from Georgia might be different from a kid in Iowa? So that is a bias that the researchers maybe didn't intend, but still exists. We also need to think about environmental differences. If you're coming from a rich neighborhood, then you're going to have more resources at your disposal. And so you're going to be able to answer certain questions that maybe weren't even a factor. Whereas if you come from a less affluent environment, you don't have those same opportunities. We also, again, need to think about our microenvironment. So where are we being surrounded? What is really affecting us? And sex differences. This has less to do with what is a natural genetic variation and more to do with what our society and culture encourages among children. And this brings us to the Flynn Effect. In the Western world, IQ scores rose substantially between 1947 and 2002. Why? Because of the Civil Rights Movement. This is when the Civil Rights Movement first really began to take off, and we started to focus more on raising the educational standards for everyone in the country, not just the white kids. And so as more resources and opportunities became available to people of color, what do you know? Their IQ scores rise substantially. The change is also demonstrated in subpopulations. So educational gap between races in the US is narrowing. In fact, today, that educational gap is almost non-existent when comparing different races. So that average score of black students versus white students, no longer an issue anymore. There are a number of factors that affect intellectual functioning. We have to look at your genes, of course. We've established that already. We have to look at your environment and the home and the school that you're living at. But we also need to consider your health, your socioeconomic status, how flexible you are, how motivated you are to perform well on this test, academic or educational adjustment, and finally the most important one, the belief that education and achievement are keys to self-development and fulfillment. If you don't think that school is important, then school's not going to be important to you, and you're not going to want to increase your IQ score because you think it's stupid. You don't think it's important. It's not really reflecting how well you do or how well your intellectual functioning is. It's really reflecting your attitude. Someone with an IQ score less than 70 is someone we would call mentally retarded or having mental retardation. Today, we tend to say that they are globally deficient. We don't really use this term anymore. It affects nearly 4 to 7 million Americans, and there are a number of genetic influences, such as Down syndrome, Fragile X syndrome. But there are also environmental influences, such as fetal alcohol syndrome, childhood diseases that might result in the child developing this condition, and exposure to environmental toxins, or inadequate medical care. On the flip side, we also have the gifted. These are people with an IQ over 145. They are considered prodigies. But the question becomes, if you are a gifted child, can you become a gifted adult? And the answer is not necessarily. You know, I had a friend of mine. He was incredibly brilliant. This was a guy that we were in the same major in college, and we were roommates, and at some point, I went on to graduate college and go on to graduate school, while he dropped out and never even finished college. He never even finished undergrad. But this was a guy that was so smart. He was so brilliant. And for fun, he took the ASVAB, or the test that the military often will have you do to figure out your placement. And once he had completed the ASVAB, it told him he should be a nuclear engineer. That's how intelligent this man was. And yet today, he is a bartender in Savannah. He's very happy, he loves his life, but some people might not consider that the most successful of lives. Why? Because when he was a kid, he was always pushed and quote-unquote encouraged and told that he could do better. B's weren't good enough, he had to have A's, and so he had a lot of pressure on himself growing up to perform well and to do really well because the adults in his life saw how intelligent he was. So what did he do as an adult? He shut down, and he completely rejected the idea of academic achievement. So this is a guy that could be a brilliant engineer, but instead chose a completely different life, and he's happy in it, but it doesn't necessarily represent his intellectual functioning. So that is it for this particular chapter. I know that was a long one, but hopefully you took very good notes. Please make sure that you are turning in all of your assignments by the due date, and I will see you next time for the next lecture.